Hello? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is now the presentation of Sandro Gaken, and he's going to talk about, he's going to give you arguments against surveillance, and this is going to be useful because I'm sure that you all have been in arguments with conservative people, and of course it's always a big problem only to say I don't like it, or of course I have something to hide. And he's going to give us real proven arguments against always stronger getting surveillance every day. Okay, please give him a warm welcome.
Yes, hello. I'm Sandro Gaken. I'm a philosopher of technology at the Institute for Science and Technology Studies in Bielefeld, living here in Berlin. And I'm also researching in the context of technology and politics, ethics and technology and so on. And within this field, I'm quite concerned with surveillance. And I feel that, also as being an activist as well, I feel that the whole surveillance discussion often lacks some substantial arguments, really. I mean, most people just say, well, I don't feel so good or something like this. So I thought I'd just kind of come here and cough up some of the real, more substantial, more material arguments. I'm going to start with sketching the outset, the situation of the activists a little. I think that as we all know, strangely, we appear to have some sort of a tough stand to defend privacy these days against people. You know, the public opinion seems to be ridden by some sort of ambivalence towards this whole issue. You know, many people say like, well, I don't have anything to hide, it doesn't concern me, I'm innocent, it's not really my problem, and so on, and they only collect useless data and so forth. So, and this really appears to be a strange situation. And I believe it is due to a certain appearance of the whole problem on the surface, because if you look at it on the surface as it appears, there are some pro-arguments in favor of surveillance, which are that we have a much more effective law enforcement against terrorism, child pornography and fraud, which are truly gruesome crimes, and these people engaged in these crimes do use electronic communication, they do use the internet substantially, and they do disguise as civilians, so there appears to be some really rock-solid rational reason to actually wiretap all these sorts of communications. And that, of course, amounts to a much better protection of life and property, and then what they say is, well, of course, that only some irrelevant data really are collected, and innocent people are largely not affected. Whereas on the contra side, most of the arguments we meet are, well, there's sort of an uncozy feeling. I don't really feel so good being surveilled, although I can't really pinpoint why or how. And of course, we do witness some minor injustices in some countries far away, which are crappy anyway and do this stuff all the time. So it's not really a big difference. And then we have this set of intellectual concerns regarding values, which comes from the scholarly discussions largely saying that we need the assumption of innocence in a very wholesome way, or we need to defend democratic values, and democratic values are being threatened, and so on. But of course, I mean, so that's sort of the public judgment, and I believe what the problem is with this surface appearance of the problem is that we have, on the pro side, we have some societally important, actual, practically relevant and objective pros, which are very factual, very material, very matter-of-factly. Whereas on the contra side, we have sort of shady arguments, not really sharp, and debatable, rather intellectual concerns, subjective contras, as for instance, you can always argue about values in democracy. Values have to change, societies have to adapt to changes and new threats, and then they have to change the constitutions and civil rights, which is sort of a natural process. So it appears that on the pro side we have material, objective pros, whereas on the contra side we have some debatable, subjective stuff, really much more really debatable. And sadly, what we can witness is that most activist discussion actually implicitly support that view. because what we find in most activist discussions is that either they stress, or in most cases they stress the high importance of the civil rights at stake, and they say, well, we have to regard the wholesomeness of these civil rights, and we have to watch them, and so on, and democracy is threatened, and so. Or they state their emotional discomfort, saying, well, I feel really encaged, imprisoned, I'm not really well with this. Or what is mostly being done is that activists debate particular technological measures a lot, like what is happening in particular and what are the technical details and so on and so forth, without really giving reasons why that is bad, of course, in the background. Or what we can also witness in activist discussion is an outright Orwellian dystopianism, which goes straight into the science fiction area, dystopian science fiction area, and says, well, we're all going to die within the next 5 years. And of course, these arguments sort of support the basic outset of the problem. I mean, what the activist does is that he basically states the same kinds of arguments, but only he weighs them differently. For him, they're more important for him and for her. But still, that doesn't change much from the that doesn't change much in the outset of the arguments as such. And I believe that really, if we continue to argue like this, we're sort of destined to have a lost cause to fight for, because we really have this situation that there's the avoidance of gruesome crimes and actual dangers versus irrelevant personal data, wholesomeness of values, individual discomfort, and so on. I know that's all debatable among us, but that's sort of what I believe to be a public image in a way. And I believe that the lost cause thing comes up due to a lack of materiality, you know, because these pro arguments are somewhat material. They have very matter-of-factly, they can say, there are really a lot of studies which say wiretapping is this and that effective, and it prevented these crimes, and we protected these many lives, and that's very basic, very material stuff to discuss, whereas that is rather, the other side is rather difficult to judge and really subjective. So, of course, that doesn't have to be like this. There are very clear-cut, very material arguments, very practically relevant, with a very factual base as well, just in as much as the pro arguments which we witness in the public discussions. Only the problem is that many of those arguments are still very much debated in scholarly circles and not quite out into the open in the public. So I believe that they really have to be delivered to the public, and that activists have to inform themselves about these things as well, and that the press as well has to inform the public about these acute and material arguments as well, because it's quite pointless to continuously bring technical details about new surveillance measures to the public if the public doesn't understand why that is all bad. So I believe in the first place you have to tell them, and really tell them substantially, why that is all bad. And so from a rather large set of possible arguments, I chose to bring some arguments here and present them today, some of the rather material contras. I'll just give you a brief overview now of what I will be talking about for the next 20 minutes. The first set of arguments which I will present will be concerned with psychological consequences emerging from surveillance. Namely, things which we will witness are a loss of the senses for autonomy, for freedom, authenticity, and individuality. And this is, of course, you have to be aware of that, to speak in a very factual manner of these things, as these are really the psychological material base of the values we're discussing. So when we're discussing these issues as psychological material things, we're not discussing the values, but rather the material presence of these values in ourselves. So that is a bit different from the value discussion. And another thing which we can witness also is the emergence of a monoculture of values and a loss of some respective abilities following in the wake of the loss of these senses which we have, which are namely the abilities to decide autonomously and freely and to judge ethically. And then, of course, we can ask ourselves if surveillance really becomes a societal phenomenon insofar as it is really being established as a substructure in all information and communication technology, which concerns really the larger public, then we can ask ourselves what happens to a society in which these psychological consequences are no longer just individual, but really happening on a large scale where really everybody is affected. And then what will emerge will be a rigid, norm-bound, and unflexible society. And of course, there's something to say on that. So that is the first set of consequences, which I will largely focus on because I believe it to be very material, interesting, and be very factual already now. Some other consequences which I will be stressing will be socio-economical consequences, which we can witness right now already, is the emergence, for instance, of a new and speculative class society based on profiling. And also very grave are some technopolitical consequences, namely that the surveillance infrastructure is quite apt for totalitarian regimes and can in principle not be prevented from being used in these regimes, which is a technopolitical problem from a philosophical point of view, but also with a very factual and acute base in the current stage of surveillance. And another overarching concern, which will be getting clearer in a bit, will be the owner dependence of all these consequences, namely that all these consequences are really being directed by the owner of the infrastructure. So, I start with the psychological consequences. One thing we all know from psychology is that there is it's a very annoying problem in the theory of science as well, is that the observer's effect. You know, if you're being observed, you behave and you think differently, you act differently, and also already on a subconscious level, whether you want to or not, you act more towards what the observer wants, towards what you think the observer wants, or if you're a rebellious nature, you act more against what the observer wants. But either way, whether you act towards or against what the observer wants, you're not yourself anymore in the full meaning of the word. You're really more acting along the framework of someone else. And that, of course, is a very basic, very well-known effect. And we also know by now that this effect also takes place even if you only feel that you're under surveillance, whether that is true or not. And now, the connection to technological surveillance, of course, is quite easily made. Namely, surveillance is a constant observer. I mean, this is really, this will be the case when once surveillance really becomes a constant substructure of information and communication technology, because when surveillance is ubiquitous and it is even able to hypothesize what you're thinking by profiling and scoring and all these things, then what we really have is sort of a technological constant observer in the substructures of our technological lives. And that, of course, is a grave problem. And here I just had this picture of George Orwell's from the movie 1984, the guy who's the big brother who's watching you, because it's such an ingenious picture of as well as really a person's face who is watching you all the time to symbolize this. And the results immediately emerging from this constant observer presence is that there is a generalized psychological preference towards conformity, towards controlling yourself, and towards controlling others. And now we can look at some impressions, at some basic senses we have when this really becomes a commonplace, a constant observer. And one thing is autonomy. If you regard autonomy not just as a value, but also as having some sort of material condensate, some material structure, then that material structure is most easily found in the psychological recognition, in an impression to really have your own set of beliefs, of premises, and to be able to independently decide from it. It's something we all know and something we all cherish. And this particular impression, this psychological impression and this material thing is, of course, immediately removed once surveillance becomes a ubiquitous substructure, because then a foreign set of premises and beliefs is constantly present and acts as a framework. And the result, of course, is that autonomy is subordinated to a framework, and then you don't really have the impression of ownness anymore, of your own beliefs and of having your own decisions and all that. And thus the impression, the sense for autonomy will shrivel. And following in the wake of that are also some other notions which largely stem from the sense for autonomy, namely the sense of freedom, which can be regarded as the impression to be able to also realize your autonomous decision, to live your autonomous life out of your own decisions. And that, of course, is already preempted when you're not really autonomous anymore. And also the sense of authenticity is the impression to have your own beliefs, and having arrived there on your own, having had your own path of life to go there, will shrivel. And quite identical to that in a sense is also the sense of individuality, as the impression to really be a person with an individual own path, you know, to be distinguishable from others. And all these notions, which are here not just abstract values but really psychological impressions which we carry in ourselves, will substantially shrivel when we have this constant observer effect from ubiquitous surveillance. That's a very material and substantial effect which we will witness from a technology. And also emerging from this is sort of a monoculture of values. I mean, now the decline of these impressions of autonomy and freedom and so on is a direct result of being surveilled. But you also have the other result that some other values are also constantly present by the presence of the constant observer. And you can easily realize this when you just think about what surveillance actually does. Namely, surveillance enforces laws, and laws always realize certain values. And some values naturally contradict others, and it's kind of the societal discussion to really just find a trade-off between values and which are most current and most actual and which are rather negligible and so on. But of course, the psychological effect which you will have with ubiquitous surveillance will be that there will be an implicit conformity with the laws, as there's always this observer watching you, and this observer is always a representative of certain values, and thus you will also have an implicit conformity and not just in your conscious mind but also in your subconscious mind with the underlying values. And the result of that will be that the law represented values really become sort of a natural thing, whereas any sense for contradicting values really will die out in a very factual biological way. And following from these psychological effects and this decline of the psychological abilities which we have, we can also see that this will certainly limit certain abilities which we have. That's a very natural effect, namely that unneeded abilities really die out. I mean, they never die out ultimately, but they certainly can shrink for a while when certain people are under slavery or so, then some abilities die out and so on. And we also have this techno-anthropological effect that where technology substitutes abilities, that those abilities shrivel as well. I mean, nobody of us knows how to work the soil anymore to get grains and food, or how to hunt and gather, because technology substitutes these necessities for us. And now what we can see, of course, following the loss of the sense of autonomy, is that the ability to decide what is best for you will be exceedingly substituted by an ability to find out what the observer wants or how to circumvent it. So everything, the whole ability of deciding will be focused largely on the observer, and thus the sense of that will change quite substantially. And the ability to decide autonomously, as we know it, will ultimately shrivel as well. And an analogous case can be made following the general loss of values, or the monoculture of values. Namely, if you're living in an environment where technology really represents values all the time, and you're constantly being surrounded by values, by a technology and by an observer who enforces these values, then of course what happens is that you do not have to make value-related decisions anymore, because all these decisions are being made for you already, and they're incorporated in the technology which you use. So all value-related decisions really are constantly preordained, have been made already, and there's no need really for a sense for values anymore or how to handle them, because that is being done for you by the technology which you use. So another result which is being feared largely is that the ability to judge ethically will be substituted by the sense to judge in accordance or in opposition with what the observer wants, which is also a quite different notion than to really decide from your own set of values or from your own feeling of morality and ethical judgment. And an interesting parallel. Oh, I'm sorry, I actually wrote that. I didn't intend to write that. By some guy in Canada whose name I forgot. Has been made. Regarding kids of overprotective mothers, because there's a huge psychological literature on kids of overprotective mothers and psychological effects emerging from that when there's a mother constantly watching over their kids, over her kids, and constantly doing all these things which, like the constant observer does. Namely, these kids get indecisive, they get very dependent on the mother, and they really have to be surrounded by them. They get sort of addicted. And they develop exactly this attitude of being either capitulating or being rebellious, so either towards or against, but no longer being themselves anymore. They have no ethical competence, which can also be witnessed in these kids. Many have really difficulties to find an own moral framework and own ethical decisions, because they're always trying to judge either in accordance or in opposition to their mother. They have little own personality, little own concepts of an own personality, and they really feel suppressed and unhappy for the vast majority of their lives. And I believe that this is a very striking, very relevant parallel, because it's just the exact same psychological effect. And I'll try to find out the name of the guy in Canada now that I've written that. So we have all these psychological effects. We have these losses of the sense of autonomy, of freedom, of individuality, of authenticity. We have this whole framework for values, which is technologically surrounding us constantly. And we have these abilities to judge autonomously and to judge ethically, to behave in a moral sense, all being technologically influenced, to say the least. And now, as the surveillance infrastructure really becomes a substructure on a societal large scale, we can of course ask ourselves what will be happening to a society in which this really becomes a dominant technology and a dominant theme, to have a constant observer always around them. And one thing which we can immediately say is that, of course, the space and abilities for reformatory thought and action are largely eradicated, because nobody will be able to think about real alternatives, or think about something that is like independent from the current system, which presides in all its values and all its laws technologically around you. So the result on a large scale will be that we will have a rigid society which is inept and impotent to internal reform, and thus impotent and also unable to adapt to external change. And that, of course, is a very dangerous thing to have, and we can ask ourselves if we can ever want that. I mean, even if my dream society would be realized, I wouldn't want it to be like this forever, or I wouldn't want it to just, stop the world right there. And people should be able to change their societies, to realize their ideas and so on and so forth, and to continuously be able to change. But if we really have surveillance as a substructure, then on a large mass psychological scale, the abilities needed for reform and needed for revolution, needed for adaptation, will be substituted and will die out, and it will be much harder for future generations to really change or to really have some sort of reform. So that's the large-scale effect, and at this, now we can briefly have a look at the psychological consequences at a glance, but I've already said all of this, and so I'm just going to skip this page. What I now want to do is to have a short break and an interlude and ask a question which certainly some conservative people would be asking now, namely, why is that all bad? You know, we can ask the justified question: if surveillance really has this ability to limit us to some general framework of what is good and right, why should that be bad? You know, we can have we can say we have the good there in the middle, and surveillance protects the good, and it does so in a psychological way, in a factual way, and we really have a means to form a better mankind in a very, very deep manner, you know. And really the good is protected and the bad and the ugly is being kept out, and that would be a great gain, of course, a great win for all of mankind. Also, they could argue, okay, we would have autonomy, and all these senses would be restricted to anything that is within the blue, so you could still feel autonomous within these few values that are being left, and within the few life paths which are being left. But frankly, I don't see why that should be bad, or so they could say. But the answer, of course, is who decides what is evil, you know? And that's a very substantial question. That is the point of the owner dependence of the surveillance infrastructure. Namely, in these circles, who decides what's the good and what's the bad and the ugly is not society, you know? It's not humankind. I mean, quite apart from the problem, from the huge philosophical problem of finding out what could be generally good or generally right, and which would not be eligible to change. But the problem also is that in concerning surveillance infrastructure, you could never, all of mankind would decide that, society wouldn't decide that, constitution wouldn't decide that, but the only one deciding what is in this blue point and in the good part and in the bad part would be the owner of the surveillance infrastructure and no one else. And that, of course, is quite a bad thing. And at this point, I can also point to a public misunderstanding, which we can now clarify when we are confronted with it. When people really say that surveillance protects life and property, we can say that that is only the case at the current stage, because at the current stage, the surveillance infrastructure is still owned by a public and regulated by a public which has an interest in the protection of life and property. And that's why that is so. It's only because surveillance protects the interests of the observer, of the guy owning the surveillance infrastructure. So we really have to reformulate that specific statement into surveillance does not protect life and property, but surveillance protects what the owner of the infrastructures defines as good and right. And that's very substantial, of course. Because to define what is good and right and what needs to be protected by surveillance can change. And one very factual and actual example of that are the socially economical consequences, which I want to stress now. And this is something which is already facing very heavy criticism from many parts of the scholarly discussions, as the knowledgeable society and information society really has a tendency to take data as a means, a substantial means to judge people. And of course, very current, very actual structure of that is profiling and scoring, because these two technological measures, profiling and scoring, they sort people into classes by their techno-informational behavior, by their electronic information communicational behavior. And they do so by hypothesizing. But, and of course, this is a very bad way to judge people, you know, to see just what has he been browsing, what has he been doing electronically. Okay, he must be this and that guy. And no judge on the world, no real judge would ever accept that as a legal judgment. But still, the classes, the profile classes which are resulting are more and more made as a basis of all economical decisions. You know, they're really being regarded by, they're being bought by companies, by insurance companies, by bank companies, And these profile, your existence in these classes really decides over if you get a credit loan, if you get an insurance for this and that, and all these things. And of course, these things are very quite life relevant decisions. And now these are based on some hypothesized profile classes, and you can't do anything against it. So that really equals the introduction of a new class society based on these profiles and based on hypothetical and optimized processes, which is already a result of surveillance. And we can now quite easily see this in the diagram which I made. Namely, in this case, it is that good equals profit, and we have the profit in this blue part, and surveillance protects the profit from the poor and the needy, and that is something which the whole profiling substructure does. And another case can be made from for the techno-political consequences, which is quite analog in a way to that. And for this, I first have to introduce the notion of a political technology. I know that this is not a very common notion, and it has been debated in the philosophy of technology for quite some time. If technology is neutral or not, you know, there's this thesis of the neutrality of technology, that really the good guy can use the gun and the bad guy can use the gun, so the gun in itself is neutral. But philosophers have been trying to really regard that and promote that as a misconception, a false conception. Technologies are not neutral because technologies have a tendency to lend themselves to certain uses, and as this tendency is more or less, you can say that, well, from 100 possible users, 80 of these users are good for these and that political intentions, and only 20 for that. And then, of course, you can say that this technology has a high tendency to be used in a politically bad manner. And that, of course, is exactly the case with the surveillance infrastructure, as it is much more apt for totalitarian use than for democratic use. You know, if you sort of put that on a scale for possible uses, you can say that the democratic use is probably like this, and then there's some shady part in which Schäuble is operating as well, and then you have this totalitarian part, and from the shady to the totalitarian, quite a few are already anti-democratic. And thus, this really is quite a substantial argument to judge surveillance infrastructure as a totalitarian technology, or at least as a technology which has a high tendency to be totalitarian, and thus be a very political technology, and as such a political action which should be subject to political processes such as voting. And if you see this, that the surveillance infrastructure can really be used 80% for totalitarian users, only 20% for democratic users, the next question which would naturally come up would be whether that the surveillance infrastructure can be made in a way that it can only be used for these 20% democratic users, and these 80% totalitarian users are impossible. And that, of course, there is a very, very substantial public misunderstanding, namely that social regulation can handle this question. People believe that, okay, we have certain laws, we have this constitution, and that really doesn't allow the people to, the surveillance owner of the surveillance infrastructure, to go all the way and use these 80% totalitarian users. But that, of course, can change. You know, I mean, if a dictator comes up, first thing he does is to skip the constitution. So that's really there goes your social regulation. So you have to regard this question as a technical question. You know, you have to ask if the technical structure can be prevented from being misused in totalitarian regimes. And then the categorical answer, of course, is no, it cannot. And not the way it is being built currently. It's quite impossible. And the result of that is that we really have an infrastructure which is being built currently and which is being completed already, so in a very current stage, which has a high tendency to be used in anti-democratic ways. And there is no option for democratic control thus far, because we're not able to vote over these measures or something. So, and these are very grave techno-political consequences, of course, which are quite substantial and quite current and acute as the infrastructure is currently built. You know, the infrastructure in its current state is already ready for a complete totalitarian misuse, and this totalitarian misuse cannot be prevented in principle, as that is a technical question and as there is no way to control this in a technical manner. So future totalitarian regimes now, if you take into account what we said previously on the psychological consequences, will have full psychological and actual control over their people, and the dystopian movie seems to be sort of pending here in the back of our heads. And surveillance infrastructure really stabilizes totalitarianism and rather destabilizes democracy, and that is already valid for the current stage in which it is. In this case, of course, we can see that the good equals what some dictator believes is good, and as totalitarian regimes are being defined as the regime of ideas over people. Hannah Arendt said that that is the idea of pure evil, to have ideas ranging over people, over individuals. Then that would be the case what surveillance would do in this case when the next dictator comes up. It really protects the dictator's ideas and interests from all other humans. So these have been the arguments. I've been trying to put them in a general thesis for you to take home with. Sort of the picture which I have in my mind is that surveillance really limits space. It limits psychological space needed to feel autonomous, to feel free, authentic individual, to have these material bases of the values in question as well. To have values in general, to be able to decide freely, to judge ethically, to live your own life. Those are being tackled in a psychological manner. Then it limits the social space as well, needed to think and live, to reform and change, as these psychological things amount to on a societal scale. And of course it does limit the actual space as it observes the actual space. And it does so uncontrollably along the definitions of the owner of the infrastructure. And that, of course, is a very bad thing. Now we can also just briefly match some intellectual concerns which are being debated very much in the scholarly discussions. You know, we have this from the theory of liberalism and of democracy. We have these four tenets of liberalism which are being discussed in philosophy all the time: is freedom, equality, democracy, and neutrality of the state. And these are intellectual in the sense that there are really abstract values based on abstract definitions, and that all the discussions really trying to find out which value is more important and so on. So that's a really theoretical thing. But now, of course, we can see that there's a very factual basis to these intellectual concerns, as the psychological consequences substantially and materially undermine freedom. Socioeconomical consequences undermine equality, as they substitute these equality by profile classes. Technopolitical consequences undermine democracy by introducing a totalitarian, tendentious technology. And owner dependence, the whole thing overarching all these consequences, really undermines the neutrality of the state in a very substantial way. So that's sort of the real McCoy. We have a better protection against certain crimes on the one hand, and on the other hand, an infrastructure which is quite apt and bound to imprison humankind in many ways of its existence along the definitions of its owner, which is a very bad thing, of course, and that now is a very material, factual, and actual concern, because it is it is resulting from a lot of material consequences of what is currently happening. Now, in a way, you could criticize me and say that many of the things I said are sort of things which will still have to happen, or which will still have to grow a bit. You could say, well, for one, surveillance is not a ubiquitous technology yet, but here we can say from the history of technology, it's a very useful thing to have, and I believe that it will be, you know. I mean, it just has to be, there just have to be very minor technical processes to really emerge, have a substructure emerging which will surveil all techno-informational behavior. And you could also say data and surveillance are not the basis for all economical or societal decisions thus far, but again we can say they will be, as that is a very useful thing, and as it is very easily realized. And then of course you could say, well, but at least there's no dictator now, But again, we can say, but there will be, you know. I mean, it's naive to think that we have a stage now where we will never have dictators again. Germany alone had like 2 in the last 100 years. So that's really naive to assume these things. And of course, this really makes these concerns not dystopian in the sense that that is science fiction far, far away, but really something which a base of what is happening right now and what will happen in the nearer future, not in the further future. And finishing, I want to make a striking analogy, namely that protecting privacy in this sort of being a future concern of something which is currently emerging is quite analogous to protecting the environment, you know, to climate change and all these issues, as privacy is the foundation of freedom, as we have now seen in a very material way, of freedom, liberty, individuality, and thus of culture and politics, and of intellectual life in general, of all the spiritual, mental, and so on. And the outset, of course, of ubiquitous surveillance and the necessary dynamics are there as well, which is also analogous to the climate case. And another thing analogous to the climate case is that once the infrastructure is there, it will be too late, because that has been a thing which has been shown by the history of technology. Quite frequently, it takes a long time to really disable a technology again, and once it is being established. So now is sort of the time for action. So what I want to end with is to state that privacy activism actually is environmentalism, as privacy is the clean water, the fertile ground, and the fresh air of all life beyond mere survival. And if you don't protect it today, don't expect to be breathing tomorrow. Privacy activism is environmentalism, and it is no less important. Thank you. Okay, now I'm open for questions. This is a book of mine coming out in December, just brief commercial here. It's about surveillance technology, and with quite a few well-known authors in German, which will present quite a few more arguments in German. So, questions? Pardon? It will be in German, yeah.
Okay, works now.
Okay, the question was what we can do to prevent this, and I believe that we really have to try a very one thing which we have to try, and which has been which philosophers have tried to realize, is to really get these technical decisions into the political realm, and to really try and make these technological decisions to realize a certain structure open to democratic decisions and open to democratic processes, which has to be done by demonstrations and by the usual civil means to get these things politicized. And that, I believe, is very substantial. And then another question would be to just develop countermeasures in a technical way to render this whole infrastructure unnecessary. Because if you really develop countermeasures against surveillance, against wiretapping, and give them to the public, and produce them on a large scale or make them easy to access, then that would really render the high costs unreasonable, and that would substantially slow the development down of surveillance infrastructure. Those would be my ideas, but that's fine.
Okay, works now. I found myself in quite a few conversations about these topics, and it's exactly the way you wrote it in the first pages about I have nothing to hide, there's nothing, it's not important, the data. And in those discussions, you need to get the point across in about 1.5 minutes. You don't have much more time. How would I accomplish this?
Pardon? I didn't get the very last.
How would I accomplish this?
To do what?
To get the point across in a short time.
Well, I would say that if you're being confronted with these arguments, you could say, well, but these things which you're now regarding as not so important, data and so on, are the very basis of your own personal individual life. And if you don't protect them right now, and if you don't try to prevent the state or somebody from intercepting them and misusing them, then that is just the very beginning of what's of the loss of all these values and of all these.
Yeah. Okay, it's still a bit abstract. I need a real life example. Maybe would be helpful. So.
Yeah, I mean, to give a really short answer, I've tried to put this in this general thesis that surveillance limits space, you know, but I mean, many things still have to develop. You still have to say that these psychological consequences still, you could say that these psychological consequences are there, that you will always have in the back of your head, you will always have the knowledge that somebody does use these data and that somebody does look into these data, and that's just the beginning of it. So you can tell the people that they will really have to watch that for I don't know, it's not very, I don't know how to really put it in one clear sentence.
Yeah.
A website? No, not a, well, from my institute, but there's not much on there.
So my question would be like, crime and all those things, surveillance is meant to deal with are kind of social problems, and surveillance looks like a technical solution to those things. And back in the days, we used to say that there is no such thing like a technical solution to social problems. And if we say, and I got that this was your suggestion, that we abolish surveillance, it would be a technical solution for our fear not being able to find a way as a society to deal with the risks of surveillance. So my point is, aren't we like, every right decision has as a conditional the possibility in itself that we can make wrong decisions. So basically the point is, are we allowed to abolish surveillance for our fear of the consequences of making wrong decisions? Wouldn't it be better to raise awareness for the risks and stuff like this? So I mean we have police, we have military, and still we manage as a society up to now to deal with the risks of all those possibilities that they can misuse. And yeah, this is the question. So is it naive to give a technical answer to a social problem once again?
Well, I mean, in a way, the technical answer to the social problem. I think that the social problem is technologically has a technological reason in the surveillance case, you know, because the political measures which are currently being instantiated by surveillance wouldn't be possible without the technology. So that really is a political act which is only possible through technology and can only be realized by technology. So the question, in a way, it's not like a social problem which has to be solved by technology, but it's a techno-social problem, a techno-political problem which has to be encountered by techno-political countermeasures, and by raising awareness particularly of the fact that this social problem is caused by technology. And that, I believe, is a very substantial thing which is still lacking in the public mind, this awareness that really political acts and many of our actions are actually only possible due to the technologies, and that they would be possible in a different way, and a different world in a way would be possible if the technologies would change.
Right, I think there is actually a very simple practical argument that you can give. I've read an article this morning about a US insurance company profiling their clients for their glycemic index, their cholesterol index, and changing the fees that they pay according to these kinds of data. Now imagine in a surveillance world if the state, for instance, profiled what kind of trading you do in terms of e-banking and investment, and if they found out that you take lots of risky investments and you're apt to lose all your money in a crash, that might affect your credit rating and thereby make you unable to take out loans and have a credit card and so on, if that kind of data were collected. So I think that's one of the practical, very, very practical arguments against that kind of surveillance.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, that's basically this argument with the socioeconomical thing which is being discussed, that really data there has been given too much power and too much importance to data, and that this importance really has to be leveled down, as it is also a hypothetical process which is underlying that. So that's really a very substantial argument, and it's being used actually in some juridical debates already to tackle this problem of profiling. But there are of course a lot of, in the juridical discussions, there are a lot of problems because all these technologies are not yet really established in the law, and it's tough to deal with them. So especially as they're being globalized, and you can also wiretap these processes from some country in Malaysia or something, and where the laws just don't count.
My impression from this presentation was if you want to compress it, then you have to concentrate on the point that surveillance only supports what the owner wants. So current surveillance is from the government, and the government wants you to comply with the law. And just imagine, first the terrorists go away, then crime goes away, and then your car goes away just because you parked your car in the wrong spot for 1 minute to just head over to the shop. So that may be possible. Do you want to comply completely with the law?
Yeah, but that is sort of a bad argument, because then
Yeah,
you're
okay,
asking...
but just for you to imagine what it would lead to. So, and if the government changes, the law changes, then, well, you're fucked up.
Yeah, and I mean, really, the ownership of surveillance infrastructure is not limited to the government, you know. I mean, also big companies could own this stuff, and other people with really crappy, shady interests could just cough up an infrastructure and use your data, use the knowledge that they gather from you against you. I mean, probably the state enforcing laws is always a bad example, because you're always saying, like, well, do you really want the state to enforce its laws? And that's always like, I mean, I have to in a way, but...
Yes, there's some little things that we can actually do, because as you said, as someone said, it's social and technological. And some funny things, because we are hackers, so we do funny things, right? Can be done to make our point, such as getting Christmas decoration in the metro station and circling the CCTV, not preventing them to function, just decorating them. And suddenly you see that it's packed with something like 10 to 20 surveillance camera in something as wide as here. And people are shocked. They laugh, but they see that actually there's plenty of cameras that are designed to disappear in the urban environment. And this is a hack too, because you show to people that actually these things are pervasive and everywhere and massive. And that freaks people out and raise awareness. And I think that's our role in terms of whistleblower, to raise the alarm and say that's a problem and a social problem, but with hacks, with things that everybody can do, easy, are fun. And I really think that's typically where we stand. Find other way to get the message through.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's a very important thing to really show people how ubiquitous the surveillance infrastructure already is, and to give them an impression, because the cameras are hidden, you know, and the tech substructures are hidden. You don't really feel that you're being surveilled all the time. And this, to raise awareness, certainly very largely consists of awakening this feeling that people really are constantly surveilled. But then still, I believe that you still have to accompany this with some rock-solid arguments on why that is bad, you know. I mean, just to say, I don't like it is not really a very good argument in some sort of public discussions aiming to get this whole issue politicized. So, but yes, I mean, raising awareness is certainly a very important and very actual thing to do at the moment.
Is this okay? Not exact. One example is not exactly about the surveillance, but similar topic. In Poland, we have currently lustracja. It's mirroring or something. It's meant for people in the power, government, and so on to confess whether or not they were cooperating with previous regime before '89. And in the very beginning, in the early 90s, it was that only members of parliament, president, and so on would have to confess whether or not they were cooperating with communist regime. And there was some political discussion, but everybody agreed that, oh, if they won't confess, so they will be. Previous regime agents will be able to blackmail them, oh, do this political act, or we will tell everybody that you were a spy or something like that. And recently there was a change of government in Poland, and new government had made institution called National Memory Institution that was given access to all data gathered by all secret services and so on, and each institution was to tell whether or not this confession was true. And also they brought in a set of people that we would have to confess, not only members of parliament, but in the first members of local governments and city councils and so on. And next version of this act was that teachers, journalists, civil service and so on. So it was estimated that about 1 million people would have to confess whether or not they were cooperating.
Oh, really?
Yes, and it was in May, or the deadline for all this confession was May 15th, and the trick was that government was requiring to confess, and government was telling whether or not this person confession was true, and government was deciding in which way to check these confessions, because if you have 1 million people to check, you won't be able to do this at once. So opposition parties were to put this act to constitutional court to check whether or not it's according to the constitution to require this, because if this institution made to check if you told the truth in your confession, if they told that it is untrue, you would be forbidden to not to vote, but to be chosen to parliament and so on for 10 years. So it's a very long period. So opposition parties were to put this act into constitutional court, and it wasn't sure that court will be able to decide whether or not it is according to constitution before the deadline. And court said that they will be able to do that, but on the 14th of May, day before court would to decide, this institution, National Memory Institute or something, told, oh, we just found that two judges from this court, we just found acts of those judges. So I think it's a rather interesting example. So
yeah, it really is a very interesting example. It's precisely an example of this problem of ownership of the infrastructure, you know, that the people who own this stuff really decide what's being surveyed, what's good and what's bad and all that. It's really very interesting.
Government wanted to disallow judges to judge the government. And then they found, oh, we found acts of these judges, and after they made the verdict that it was unconstitutional, journalists from independent media went to this act, and they discovered that those acts was not that judges was cooperating, but they refused to cooperate, even though they were blackmailed to cooperate. So
yeah, it's a very interesting example. I didn't know about that. Thank you.
Okay.
Eine Frage noch? Okay. One more question. Okay.
Yeah, I somehow wanted to question this one statement that the state has to enforce law, because the point is that, of course, there are some laws that the state definitely has to enforce, and these are the ones that are usually taken as an example. So I mean, you already had them, child pornography and things like that, but then as the technology is installed, it tends to be applied to less and less and less severe crimes. And then on the other hand, I would assume that once you have a I mean, at the moment there's a natural barrier to trying to enforce some laws on some aspects, because this just cannot be done without technology. But once technology is in place, I would expect that there are even more laws regulating in rather detailed way everyday life. And I am not sure whether people are aware what it would mean that every law that is actually exists in Germany really is automatically enforced. Most people, I think, definitely would not like that. And I think there's even one example. If you look at the information gathered on the highways, most people, by this automatic tax system, most people basically would not care as long as this is not used to determine whether they are driving too fast or not.
Yeah, I mean, sure, it even wouldn't be possible to enforce all laws, because quite a few are contradicting other laws. But I believe that quite generally it is the attitude of the state to use this infrastructure to enforce laws. And I mean, you can't really argue against that. Of course, that is something which you can say, well, there has to be some relation as to how staunch, how strongly you really enforce law. But I just believe that for any sort of public political discussion, it's a bad argument to just say, well, they don't have to enforce the law so badly. You know, I mean, that's just all I wanted to say. I'm not in favor of enforcing laws so very strongly, but I just believe it's not a good argument to argue against that particular case. Okay, then that's the end. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you again.